Hello and good afternoon. This is Judy Wiley. I'm the program manager for the Native American Parent Technical Assistance Center. Welcome to this webinar. We're so excited to do tribal sovereignty and parent outreach. For anybody who is not Native American and has not grown up understanding tribal sovereignty, this is a really hard topic to handle. So we have spent a lot of time designing and researching this topic, and we're hoping it will be incredibly useful to the listeners. For any of you that have traveled to another country, unlike me, and had the opportunity to do some travel beyond the United States, know that when you go over to another country, there's different rules and regulations, such as maybe in the UK, in Ireland. When you're over there, you drive on the left-hand side, not on the right-hand side. So if you use the same rules that we have in America, you could get in a pretty fatal accident pretty easily if you continue to follow the rules and regulations of the United States. So it's really important to understand tribal sovereignty, what it means to native tribal lands, what it means to native people, and we're going to try to tackle this very difficult topic. And so if you have any questions after the webinar, please feel free to call us directly at the Native American Parent Technical Assistance Center. The number is 505-250-4144. I know Robin Butterfield, as Native people, we live tribal sovereignty, and it makes it's easy for us to understand. It's one of those foundational knowledge that we have as Native people. But for others listening, it may not be that easy to understand. So we want to give you kind of some foundational principles about what tribal sovereignty is and how we as Native people operate under this tribal sovereignty system. So just a few housekeeping notes here. You are all muted, so you're not going to be able to ask any questions directly. We just find it's easier to operate a webinar without everybody on the phone, and then we don't get background noise and people talking to other people in their offices. So if you would like to, there is a chat box over on the right-hand side. And if you want to click on the chat box, you can ask a question or put a statement in that chat box. And then at the end of the workshop, what we will do is Kelsey and I will try to look at the chat box and make sure that Robin has the opportunity to respond to any of those questions that are in the chat box. We are recording this webinar, so it will be posted to our website. And it will be archived. I'll send out an announcement when it is up and posted so other people can view it. I want to thank Kelsey Woodley for managing this webinar for us. He's our technical assistance person at NAPTAC, and he does all the setup of the webinar and everything. I also want to thank Robin Butterfield for, again, agreeing to present on a very complex topic. When we, as the writing team, decided to tackle tribal sovereignty, it took us months and months and months of going back and forth and trying to make this understandable. So thank you, Robin, for all your work you did on this. Robin Butterfield has been the Senior Program Policy Specialist and Analyst for Quality School Programs and Resources at the National Education Association. She has also worked for the Bureau of Indian Education in the Center of School Improvement, Professional Development. How I met Robin Butterfield is she previously also worked for the Oregon Department of Education as the Indian Education Civil Rights Specialist. So Robin and I have known each other for many, many years. When I worked in Oregon, working with the 9 federally recognized tribes of Oregon, she was at that time the Indian Education Director for Oregon, and was instrumental in moving some of the policies about Indian education forward in Oregon. So with that, I think I've got all the housekeeping done. We are going to do a poll later on in the presentation, and that's more a heads up for the listening audience, those of you who I know don't do this, but may be checking email right now, writing up your continuation reports, whatever you're doing, we're going to make sure you're paying attention. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Robin Butterfield. Thanks, Robin.
Okay, thank you, Judy, and good morning, everybody. It's morning here in Oregon, so so let's just launch right in. One thing Judy didn't mention, I don't think, is I'm Winnebago and Chippewa, so just want to let you know my tribal background. So next slide, please. I always like to start with this quote from Paulo Freire because it's such a powerful one about education in general. And since we're, you know, about educating parents and working with children with disabilities, it's really important to, I think, philosophically understand that we are about the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality, and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. Because especially working with a population like American Indians, we tend to feel like our ability to impact the world has been taken away from us with specifically education that was imposed on us. So I love this quote. Next slide. So our success targets for today, what we hope you will leave this webinar with, is the ability to explain what tribal sovereignty is, being able to list some of the benefits of treaties for tribes, as well as the benefits of what treaties did for the U.S. federal government, because it was a reciprocal relationship in the beginning. Everybody was to benefit from these documents, which still stand and guide the relationship between two sovereign entities, the federal government and tribes. And then the last success target is we really want to focus on some strategies that you could use for doing outreach with American Indian and Alaska Native tribes and communities. Next slide. So how we're going to progress through this PowerPoint is we want to spend some time talking about what sovereignty is and why it is so important to understand that concept when working with tribes and tribal members, because it really sets the tone for building relationships in a respectful way. We also are going to talk about sort of that whole treaty making period, because it was a recognition of sovereignty, and in understanding that process, I think helps us understand how powerful sovereignty and those treaties have been, and how they're still being ruled on in the courts today. We also are going to talk a little bit about the benefits both to tribes and the U.S. government, and then some of the considerations for outreach. So those are kind of the 5 focus areas for our PowerPoint. Next slide. So the first thing if I were doing this with a large group, would ask everybody, I want you to think about, how would you define sovereignty, and why are tribes said to be sovereigns? So this is an opportunity for each of you to sort of think about what you already know about sovereignty. But because we don't have the opportunity for a verbal exchange, we'll just move on to the next slide. So some of the things, if we were just brainstorming, that people often come up with, they might say that nations are sovereigns, sovereignty has something to do with self-government. They might mention inherent rights or the right to determine one's own affairs. Those are some of the kind of brainstorming answers that we might come up with. But this slide is the actual quote that George W. Bush gave early in his presidential election as president, in which he said, tribal sovereignty means that it's sovereign, you've been given sovereignty and you're viewed as a sovereign entity. So he kind of stumbled around, and this is actually something you can pick up on YouTube, where he's trying to define sovereignty, but you can tell that he's not comfortable, with the explanation. And it clearly illustrates how little the general public knows about the relationship of tribes as sovereigns with the federal government, which is also a sovereign. The word given is important here because it emphasizes that it does not recognize that sovereignty is an inherent right that tribes had at the time of treaty making and goes back since time immemorial. In fact, treaties recognize that tribes were nations. It wasn't that they were given sovereignty, they were recognized that they were already sovereigns and had the right to govern their own affairs. So it's important to discuss this aspect because the entire PowerPoint will further clarify how complex and important the understanding of sovereignty is. So this is a really good example from someone in a leadership position who is also obviously confused about what sovereignty is. Next slide. So sovereignty, we know that it was recognized, it recognized tribes specifically in the U.S. Constitution in two places. In this Commerce Clause, which is Article 1, where Congress shall have the power to, collect taxes, etc., and to regulate. At the very bottom of this slide, it says to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. So it's classifying tribes in the same context as foreign nations and states, which are two other recognized sovereigns. So we go all the way back to our founding constitutional documents to verify that tribes were viewed at the time of signing treaties as sovereigns. Next slide. So why is it so important to understand sovereignty, especially when working with American Indians? Well, number one, it constitutes a legal, political status and acknowledges the right of self-government. It recognizes that tribal governments are distinct, independent entities with unique authority. And it means that from tribe to tribe, the rules, the customs, the protocols, the example that Judy gave, about driving on the other side of the road in Great Britain, that's just an example of how varied just simple customs can be. But one of the real important understandings of sovereignty is that it sets American Indians and Alaska Natives apart from all other entities and racial groups. because there's a legal, political distinction in terms of how American Indians relate to the federal government and to society at large. It's very different from, say, being Asian American or African American. They do not have this legal political relationship. Next slide. So here's the other place where there is mention of not tribes specifically, but treaties. And because tribes entered into treaties, this part of the Constitution recognizes that those treaties themselves have the same authority that the U.S. Constitution has. So just to read it along with you, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So that's what tribes use when they go to court, is the recognition that these documents have the authority that the U.S. Constitution has. And that it further says, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So that gives huge weight to the documents that were signed between the U.S. government and tribes. Next slide. So the understanding of tribal sovereignty is really key to understanding many current issues involving American Indians, Alaska Natives. And it's best understood in the lessons of politics and government, but it impacts, you know, every aspect of tribal life. And there's a slide coming up where we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it can be taught, you know, as early as 3rd or 4th grade. And in the state of Washington, where I was working for a period of time, there is a curriculum called Since Time Immemorial, and we do lessons about sovereignty with even 3rd and 4th graders. So those understandings can be developed very early on. Next slide. So one of the real important concepts, and this goes back to the slide with President Bush, where he didn't really recognize inherent rights, which means that at the time of treaty making, tribes were already governing their lands and themselves before contact. So they already had that existing authority over their own tribal members. So inherent rights were retained with treaties. They weren't given. They were just acknowledged and then retained over time, even to today. So the inherent rights have been reaffirmed repeatedly through case law and the Supreme Court. Many of the issues related to the rights that were agreed to in treaties have been taken all the way to the Supreme Court, and I'm going to give an example later in the slideshow. Next slide. I guess one more thing to sort of acknowledge is that, you know, inherent rights, it's such an important concept because it acknowledges that tribes were negotiating those treaties from a position of power and authority. So it wasn't, they were certainly giving up certain things, but they were also asking for certain things. So what are just some basic inherent rights of sovereigns? These are listed here, you know, the right to determine your own form of government, to make and enforce laws, and the conditions of citizenship. So here's an area where from tribe to tribe, you will see a huge difference in terms of who qualifies as a member. I'll give you one example. I am Ho-Chunk or Winnebago, and in Nebraska, to be a tribal member, you must be 1/4 degree Indian blood. In Wisconsin, the Ho-Chunks were the same tribe, but same people, but in Wisconsin, to be a member, you have to be a half. And so each tribe has the ability to determine who is a citizen. There's often teasing in Indian country about being Cherokee, because the Cherokee blood quantum is almost down to just descendancy, where you can have very, very little Cherokee blood to be a tribal member. And so, we hear lots of people claim to have Cherokee ancestry. So that always makes them a little suspect, because we're never sure if that really means that, they live and work in their community, they understand their tribal traditions, or if they're just claiming, some small blood quantum. So that's one small area of what sovereigns can do that can vary tremendously across tribes. There's lots of other ways in which these powers of being a sovereign can play out. On the one that says to impose and collect taxes, that's why sometimes there are on-reservation fireworks stands in the summer, because off-reservation the state may say you can't sell fireworks, but on the reservation you can. Or tobacco is not taxed on some tribal lands. And certainly casinos is another big example of how tribal sovereigns have been exercising their right of self-government and regulation of property use, which is one that's listed there. Next slide. So this is a continuation. There are tribal court systems that are set up in communities, and I don't think the next to establishing a monetary system or making war or peace are exercised in the case of native tribes, because we are sovereigns within a sovereign. And so some of those, that's why it gets complicated, because some of those issues are not really allowed for tribes to exercise. But in general, that's the kind of thing that sovereigns are allowed to do. And I really appreciate this picture of President Obama, because he was such an ally for tribes during his administration. He recognized tribal sovereignty and required all of the national agencies, commerce, education, Department of Interior, Health and Human Services, all of the directors of those agencies were required annually to meet with the tribes in Washington, D.C. as a recognition of sovereignty. And they had to articulate to the tribes how they were working to make sure that tribes were accessing the resources that they were entitled to via treaty. So he was a really strong ally of sovereignty during his administration and was much appreciated for that. Next slide. So as you can see, the responsibilities of being a sovereign impact all aspects of tribal communities, education, environmental protection, healthcare, safety and security, all of the things that are listed here. And in working in the states here in the Northwest, as I have, because I've been involved with education, the states have been working in a government-to-government relationship, with tribes. I know in many of the other states like New Mexico and Minnesota, Montana, a lot of the states are aware of how important it is to coordinate with tribes. In Washington State, each of the agencies, just like President Obama did, meet monthly to go over what the state agencies are doing on behalf of tribes. So, there is a lot of coordination, collaboration that is happening in some places of the country in recognition of sovereignty. Next slide. So we're going to talk just a little bit about treaties. This picture, by the way, is thanks to Lisa Cooper, who works with us. She pulled this, and it's involved. It's actually the 1865 treaty with the Ponca tribe. And so in many states, you will be able to pull up the treaties that were actually agreements that impact the tribes in your own area. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why treaties were made with tribes and what the exchange was in those documents. Next slide. So the question is, why were treaties made? Next slide. I want you to think about what your understanding of treaties. So these are formal, negotiated, written agreements between two sovereigns, between governments. And in the negotiation, each party then agreed to take on certain responsibilities and obligations. And in doing that, it actually limited the exercise of sovereignty for both parties. So there are some things that can happen through tribal courts that are not interfered with by other entities, and vice versa. There may be things that happen outside of the reservation that are in the control of the state. And so that's why there's such an important need for negotiation between who does what. And we already recognize that in Article 6 of the Constitution that these documents are the agreement that these are part of the supreme law of the land. So they are valid today, just like they were at the time of signing, because there are a lot of people in our country, just general population, that don't really understand this. And they think, well, these are just old documents. Why do they entitle Native people to certain rights and resources? Okay, next slide. So if we understand treaties as land contracts, you know, that grant rights to the United States by tribes, so the tribes were expressly in a position of power, and they were giving up certain lands and resources. So what the treaties described is what was expressly retained by the tribes and what was expressly relinquished, and what it was expressly not relinquished, because in some of the treaties, tribal members required that they still be allowed to hunt and gather in their usual and accustomed places, even though they weren't living on those tracts of land. And that becomes a really important understanding, as you'll see later when we talk about sort of the case in Washington, but it has implications for all other tribes in the United States, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. So next slide. So when the federal government began making treaties, they were making them for their own purposes. And this is a list of, you know, sort of the periods of time in which types of treaties were negotiated. So there were the early colonial treaties, you know, from 1600 to 1776. There was a short period where treaties were made for alliances, you know, between the French and Indian Wars. And then in 1784, tribes began to cede lands. And then there was a period of time where during the Civil War, treaties were made. And then the 1865 to 1868 is kind of the they call it the Great Peace Commission, where you know, most of the treaties, you'll see the dates of most of these treaties were signed. And so they ended primarily the major treaty making period around 1871. And after that, they don't call them treaties, but they were more agreements with tribes around certain aspects of tribal governance. Next slide. So we're going to try a little poll here. And this is, if we were doing a workshop, would be a way to sort of help people understand the notion of privilege versus a right. And so one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to read some statements, and I want you to look over on your sort of dashboard and look for the word polls. And so I'm going to ask you to make a decision whether a statement that I read is either a right or it's a privilege. So you only can choose between those two words, as I understand it, and we'll kind of see you know, where people are. The purpose of this activity really is to create a discussion. So we won't be able to have the discussion, but we're going to try and do the poll part and see how that works out. So let's give it a try. So if you've clicked on you know, poll, if I read the statement, getting an education, is that a right or is that a privilege? So go ahead and mark what you think it is. Let's see if it's working. Can you hear me?
It disappeared after like 2 seconds.
Okay, because I've lost my my visual. It doesn't look like, well, on mine I can't tell if anybody's voting.
The poll didn't stay up for very long. It stayed up for like 2 seconds.
Oh, should I try it again?
We can try the next one and see if it stays up for longer.
Okay, so let's try the next one. Getting a driver's license, is that a right or is that a privilege? Okay, so, okay, so people are voting, okay, and it looks like most people think that that is a privilege. All right, so we would have a discussion after this if we were in the room together. All right, how about eating candy in the classroom? Is that a right or is that a privilege? Okay, that looks like that is a privilege according to the group here. Okay, let's go to the next one. Being able to study in a quiet place, is that a right or is that a privilege? Okay, so we're getting a mix on this one. We've got about 53% say it's a right, 47% say it's a privilege. So we would have a really good discussion around this one because there's a real split in terms of the poll. Okay, how about the next one? Breathing clean air. Is that a right or is that a privilege? Okay, so most people have put that it's a right, and a few have put that it's like 94% say it's a right and it's a privilege. And we would get into a really good conversation with this one because, you know, especially given that, you know, President Trump has just done away with all of the restraints on coal mining and stuff that pollute the air. We all believe it's a right, and yet, you know, here's a actual law that's doing away with our right to have clean air. So you can see how some of these issues can get into some really good discussions. Let's do the next one. Drinking healthy water, is that a right or is that a privilege? Okay, so we've got about 13% that say it's a privilege and 88% say it's a right. So here again, I think we would get into some really good conversation, you know, about why is that a privilege? And depending on where you live in the world, you know, how it can come across as a privilege. Okay, let's do just two more. Next one, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Is that a right or is that a privilege? Okay, so we have 71% voted and everybody says that it's a right. And yet, how many people in our country are not able to experience liberty and the pursuit of happiness? So this again would be a really interesting conversation. And finally, the last one that we'll do is expecting that a treaty or a contract will be followed. Is that a right or is that a privilege? So we have most of the voters have said that it's a right. And indeed, that's the perspective that most tribes have upheld. You know, we make agreements that treaties are going to be upheld. So that's why tribes take these issues all the way to the Supreme Court to ensure that indeed what they thought they agreed to is in place. Okay, Kelsey, I've lost my slide show. Are you there? Kelsey?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
So how do I get back to my slides?
1 second. Are they back now?
No, it's not up here.
Okay, you might have to rejoin. You might have accidentally closed your window.
Okay, should I just log back on? Oh wait, here we go.
If you close this,
I've got it.
there you
I'm
go.
good.
Okay.
Okay, so in general, one of the things that this activity I think highlights is, oh, next slide. We'll go, this is just the directions. Yeah. So one of the things that comes out of this activity after we've had some good conversation around these various ideas, and we could come up with probably some other examples of right versus privilege, but that there is a distinction between personal rights, rights of groups, and then rights of nations. And in the conversation, I think it's important to highlight, you know, that as individuals, we feel we're entitled to certain kinds of things, but that doesn't also necessarily mean we get them. The second thing is that rights issues are complex, as we can see in the conversations, and that they often have to be taken to court. So you can have a right, but if you don't exercise it, then it doesn't necessarily mean that you get to live with that right. And that in general, courts have tended to rule in favor of tribes and when they take their issues to court, and that the binding legal agreements between tribes and the federal government establish why there is a distinction between Indians and other racial ethnic groups, because other groups cannot take their issues to court because they don't have treaties or written agreements with the federal government. Okay, next slide. So because of treaties, the federal government, you know, the tribes gave the U.S. government millions and millions of acres of land. They also relinquished rights to water, timber, and minerals. So they gave up basically most of this continent, and it's acknowledged via these treaty documents. They also gave up sources of economic development in doing that. Much of the land is held in public domain through forests and parks. And these resources are still used today to pay off the national debt and finance government operations. So, you know, in making these treaties, the U.S. government really came out ahead compared to what tribes ended up with. So let's go next slide to the benefits for tribes. Next slide.
I think your computer's just being a little slow.
Next slide. I think you skipped over the benefits to tribes. It's one, yeah. So what did tribes get out of the treaties? Well, they got tracts of land. You know, some of that land is still held in trust by the federal government, and so there are negotiated relationships between who's managing what parts of the lands, and this is where it gets really complicated. And if we had more time, I'd give you the example of sometimes when the federal government has been in charge of certain resources, it's been mismanaged, and you know, tribes have taken them to court and have had huge settlements because of that trust land. But secondly, the right to continue to hunt, gather, and fish in their usual and accustomed places is in most of the treaties, so that even though they gave up land and were assigned certain reservation tracts of land, they still acknowledged that in order to hunt and fish, they would have to go off of those lands and be able to hunt and fish. But they also were given the right to continue to govern their own affairs, and they were given certain protections and services through health and human services and education. So in those treaties, that's why American Indians are granted, you know, certain economic development resources. And the treaties retain supports for tribes and tribal members in perpetuity, as President Monroe stated in 1817, and it's a quote, "as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow." So that's why the treaties are still considered active and current. Next slide. So American Indians then have dual citizenship. Their individuals are members of tribal nations, but they're also members of the United States. And it wasn't until 1924 when tribal members were given citizenship to the United States. And because of sovereignty, tribal members were considered members of their tribes only up until World War I. But given that American Indians fought and died for the United States, you know, members of tribes were finally acknowledged as U.S. citizens after the war. And at this point, they were recognized as citizens of two different nations. But it's ironic that on our own lands, we were not acknowledged as fully enfranchised citizens until 1924. Next slide. So this next series of slides I'm going to try and go through kind of quickly, but it sort of is a example of how sovereignty has to be challenged in order to be exercised. So we're going to use the state of Washington and talk a little bit about the fishing wars and the importance of fighting for sovereign rights, and which ended in a Supreme Court decision by Judge Bolt. And this it was a landmark decision which acknowledged that treaties were active and gave tribes, rights to fish in the state of Washington. But it's also an example of the ongoing public ignorance about what sovereignty is. So it's a good way to sort of explain sovereignty in more detail. Next slide. So in the 1850s, the United States entered into a series of treaties with the tribes in Washington state, and the tribes agreed to part with their land, but they insisted on protecting their fishing rights, and that was throughout the Washington territory. So they were told in the treaty that they had the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations, and it is secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory, and of erecting temporary houses for the purpose of curing the same. So that was the actual language in the treaty. So next slide. So in the 1960s, when tribal members began to exercise that right, that is, they were fishing on rivers, tributaries of the Puyallup River in northwest Washington, they were stopped by many fish and wildlife employees of the state, and the state had its own laws. In 1889, it says Washington, when it became a state, it passed laws to curtail tribal fishing in the name of conservation. And so you had this tension between tribes trying to fish and the state trying to prevent them from fishing. So after a number of tribal people were hauled off to jail for fishing on the rivers, and there's actually a number of films of people being literally dragged off of the riverbanks with their fishing nets. The 8 treaties between the tribes and the Puget Sound, remained fully in force according to the Bolt decision, which came about finally in 1975. And the tribes were allowed to continue to be, they were recognized as sovereigns with the authority to regulate their salmon harvest. And the big decision was that the tribes had the right to harvest 50% of all salmon in the Pacific Northwest. Well, you can imagine how this decision then enraged, commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen. Of course, the tribes would never harvest that many salmon, but it was a statement that was acknowledging their right to have that impact on the salmon catch. And in reality, the tribes actually felt like they were entitled to 100%. So again, they felt like they were relinquishing a portion of the harvest, where others saw them as gaining too much of the harvest. So you can see where the tension around tribals exercising tribal sovereignty, created issues with other entities in the state. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So I really like this quote by Charles Wilkinson, because, the tribes really fought hard to hold on to their right that was guaranteed them in the treaties. And I liked Charles Wilkinson's quote, and I'll just read it. He said, "The truest and most profound fact about the Bolt decision is that it was conceived and accomplished by Indian people themselves. Indian people at the council tables, on the rivers, on the shores, at the smokehouses, and at the sacred sites, who had the vision, the strategy, and the fierce determination to carry out a victorious crusade that at the beginning seemed impossible to all but themselves." And so I think that's a real statement about how tribes have had to really fight to have their rights of self-government and their treaties be honored. Next slide. This slide is just an acknowledgement of even after the Bolt decision, there was a piece of state legislation that mentions treaties down there in the box. It was Initiative 456 that was approved in 1984. But it was basically acknowledging that the general population still thought that with a vote in the state legislature you could override what the treaties say, and that's not possible. The only way to change the agreements in treaties is by an act of Congress, and that gets into a whole nother complicated area which tribes have had to deal with, called termination and restoration, and I'm not going to go into that in this particular slide, but it basically is a way of acknowledging that federal law supersedes state law, and thus, you know, the state law and others like it are basically illegal. They have no real impact because the treaties are with the federal government. Next slide. So this slide is just to show that the Bolt decision set a very strong precedent, and what followed in Washington specifically were all of these other settlements around shellfish and dams and land claims, etc. But it basically acknowledges the balance of power that previously had not been acknowledged for tribes that impacted other areas of decisions. But not only in Washington state, it has impacted relationships all across the country between tribes and states. Next slide. This one is just to acknowledge that it wasn't until this is in 2014, Senate Bill 2080 in Washington state basically acknowledged that Native people and non-Natives as well were actually convicted of misdemeanors and felonies when they protested on the rivers. And so this basically allows them to take away the sentencing, vacating any of the records that individuals who had participated in that was undone. But it took until 2014 from 1975. So that's a long period of time before the state acknowledged, in essence, its wrongdoing by imprisoning and sentencing individuals for standing up for their rights based on their sovereignty. Next slide. Okay, so what does all of this then mean for outreach? Well, it means that, you know, tribes are very distinct governing entities, and that it's important to consult with them in terms of anything that impacts tribal members in any sort of comprehensive way. It also suggests that because they're political entities, their leaders may change periodically because they have separately elected governing bodies, and that there's often, you know, local issues and politics that would be important to understand and that will vary from tribe to tribe. It also suggests that there are certain protocols that will vary from tribe to tribe. And because tribes are responsible for everything, from economic development to water rights to land use to health and human service issues, that, you know, they're busy making a lot of decisions, and that interacting with them may take time. So each tribal government usually has an administrator and multiple departments, including the Tribal Education Department, which we call TEDS. And those might be good sources of contact. So if you understand the whole context of what tribes are doing and the fact that they're very busy if you're trying to get something out of a tribe, it may take time and knowing kind of who to go to. Next slide. So some things that might be useful is thinking about where in the tribe you might want to post announcements or invitations. Some places that I would suggest would be like the Indian Health Clinic, if there's one, the local grocery store, maybe the post office, a school, you know, sort of some logical community gathering places would be good places to post notifications for meetings or trainings or just general information. And also getting to know the tribal education director and their staff. They may have more than one individual, and working through them to set up trainings or information sharing. A lot of tribes have their own newspaper and even radio, so using those as ways to advertise events. But I think each one of the centers, our parent contact centers, should probably have a directory of contacts. In fact, one of the worksheets that we've listed here for the this webinar are just some suggested ways to organize that information. And Lisa developed both of those that give you a chance to kind of create your own directories. And we also have some that are posted for statewide contacts. I know we've been working on Idaho, and I'm not sure which other ones are up there. But and then finally, just paying attention to the tribe's community events, because there are lots of times when, like, say there's a powwow or a rodeo or a gathering at the school, or there might be some traditional type of celebration that's open to the public. Some are not open to the public, but many are. So those might be places where you can set up a booth and display information, you know, about your center and the services that you provide. So those are just some brief examples and thoughts about how to interact with tribal communities. Next slide. So here's some examples that the worksheets that we've attached look like this. And so you might be able to use these worksheets to begin your outreach to the tribes in your area. Next slide. So call us, write us, or visit us on the website.